Ever tasted something so good it felt like history on a plate? These lost soul foods were cooked slow, shared loud, and loved hard by your grandparents' generation. What if the best flavors we ever had are the ones we forgot to keep? Ashcake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ashcake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes. Grease gravy rice was what people cooked when they refused to let anything go to waste. When breakfast meats were done frying, the leftover grease became treasure. A spoon of flour went in first, sizzling and popping until it turned golden. Then milk or water got poured in, slow and steady, until it thickened into smooth gravy. That hot gravy poured over white rice made something out of nearly nothing. It was salty, creamy, and smoky all at once. The smell filled the house and the taste filled the stomach. Parents called it breakfast, but it could carry a family through an entire day. It came from kitchens that knew survival like a second language, where flavor was earned from thrift and patience. Kids grew up thinking it was comfort food, not knowing it was born from rationing and struggle. Grease gravy rice was more than a recipe. It was a declaration that no meal was too small to matter. Every bite was a promise that the family would eat, even when times were lean. It was humble food that carried pride on a spoon. Pot scrapin soup was the kind of meal that made use of every last bit that life gave. When the pantry was empty, people turned to what clung to the bottom of the pot. They poured in hot water, scraped up every browned edge and leftover piece of vegetable or meat, and built a new meal from what was left behind. It simmered for hours until the flavors came together, smoky and deep, with hints of salt and spice from earlier meals. No two pots ever tasted the same, and that was the beauty of it. Sometimes it had bits of onion, sometimes beans or bones, always something saved from before. It filled the air with a smell of gratitude, the kind that made even the poorest home feel rich. Children dunked stale cornbread in it, soaking up every drop. Pot scrapin soup reminded families that nothing was ever truly gone, not flavor, not hope, not care. It turned waste into warmth and leftovers into love. The sound of that bubbling pot was a hymn for survival, proof that the end of the week still had something worth waiting for. Corncob jelly was one of those miracles that made people smile at their own cleverness. When the corn was shucked and the cobs left behind, no one dared to throw them out. Those bare cobs went into a big pot of water, boiled until the water turned golden and sweet-smelling. Sugar and a little lemon juice got added next, then everything was strained until the liquid gleamed like honey. The result was a jelly that tasted faintly of corn, syrupy and light, the perfect spread for biscuits or toast. People used it when fruit was scarce, and it carried a quiet pride that came from turning scraps into sweetness. Grandparents remembered it from their childhood, when waste was not an option and imagination ruled the kitchen. Corncob jelly was proof that flavor could be coaxed out of what others might ignore. It was soft, shining, and made with patience. Those who tasted it never forgot that feeling of abundance born from scarcity. Each spoonful told the story of hands that worked hard, saved everything, and still found time to make something beautiful. Pea hull broth was a whisper of a meal, simple but steady. It started after shelling peas for supper, when the hulls piled high in the bowl. Instead of tossing them, families boiled them down into a thin, tea-colored broth. The scent filled the room, earthy and green, like the smell of gardens after rain. Some added salt, others a small spoon of butter, but most drank it plain, grateful for what it offered. It was a tonic for the tired, a light soup for those who had more hunger than food. During lean seasons, it became the first course and sometimes the only course. It carried vitamins, flavor, and memory in one humble bowl. Pea hull broth showed the wisdom in using everything, even what others called waste. It was not fancy, but it was faithful, feeding families with nothing more than time, heat, and care. The warmth of it settled deep, a quiet kind of comfort that made the world feel generous again. Lard cakes were the sweetheart of hard times, the kind of dessert that brought back joy when butter was a dream. Made from flour, sugar, and a scoop of lard saved from breakfast, they baked up soft and fragrant. The smell filled the house, buttery without butter, rich without cream. People called them poverty cakes, but they tasted like victory. The lard kept them moist for days, and a touch of spice or molasses made them taste like something from a bakery. Children licked the crumbs from their fingers, not caring that it came from the same jar used for frying eggs. Every family had their own version, some with raisins, some with cinnamon, each one proud and personal. Lard cakes were a reminder that sweetness was not about luxury. It was about invention. They were proof that love could rise from scarcity, baked golden in worn pans and shared without shame. In kitchens filled with laughter and thrift, lard cakes turned necessity into delight. Onion skin tea was one of those old remedies that could quiet both body and soul. When someone had a cough or a fever, or when food simply ran out, a pot of this humble tea came to the rescue. Dried onion skins were gathered from the corners of the kitchen, rinsed and steeped in boiling water until the liquid turned golden brown. The scent was sharp but comforting, a mix of earth and sweetness that filled the air with warmth. Some added honey if they had it, or a squeeze of lemon, but even plain, it had its own charm. People believed it could heal and strengthen, and maybe it did, because hope itself can be medicine. Onion skin tea was born from patience, brewed by hands that knew how to stretch every last bit of life from what they had. It was the taste of resilience and care, a sip that made you believe tomorrow might be gentler. Crumb fried saltfish was proof that even the toughest cuts could be transformed with a little creativity. Saltfish was cheap and lasted forever, but it was hard and strong-flavored, needing love and time to make it shine. Families would soak it overnight, then roll it in crushed biscuit crumbs before frying it in a skillet until golden. The smell of it could draw neighbors from down the street, salty and rich with that perfect crisp edge. Paired with grits or boiled greens, it made breakfast feel like a celebration. The crumbs gave it crunch, the oil gave it warmth, and the memories gave it meaning. In every southern kitchen, there was a version of this dish waiting to happen, handed down and reimagined through generations. Crumb fried saltfish was not fancy food, it was pride disguised as thrift, a simple recipe that carried the power to feed both stomach and spirit. Eggshell pudding was an act of pure ingenuity, a sweet custard built from things no one thought could be used. Families saved eggshells, washed and dried them, then ground them into powder for extra calcium. That powder went into milk, sugar, and cornstarch, stirred together until it thickened over the stove. It set in jars or bowls, smooth and pale, a dessert that looked humble but held the taste of patience. It was soft, slightly sweet, and carried the faint scent of vanilla if a family could afford it. Children thought it was magic, how scraps turned into something good. It filled more than bellies. It filled hearts with gratitude. Eggshell pudding was the promise that nothing had to go to waste, that even the smallest fragments had purpose. In every spoonful was the spirit of endurance, a quiet hymn to survival sung right from the kitchen stove. Churn milk soup was what you made when you had finished making butter and still needed a meal. That leftover buttermilk became the base for a tangy, hearty soup that could feed a family from a single pot. It was mixed with cornmeal, herbs, and whatever vegetables were on hand, then simmered until it thickened like velvet. The smell was sharp but cozy, filling the kitchen with warmth and familiarity. Some families dropped bits of bread into the bowl, letting it soak up the flavor. It was simple food, born from old farm routines and frugal wisdom. Churn milk soup taught that nothing should ever be wasted, not even the scraps of a good day's work. It soothed hunger and reminded everyone that comfort could come from the most ordinary things. With each spoonful, it carried the echo of laughter and work from generations before. Sorrel leaf stew was the taste of home for generations who carried their roots wherever life took them. The wild green leaves, bright and tangy, grew freely along fences and fields, waiting for careful hands to gather them. Washed and simmered with onions, garlic, and a little oil, they softened into a dark green broth that shimmered in the pot. Sometimes salted pork or dried fish bones were added for depth, but even without them, the stew stood proud. Its flavor was sharp and earthy, sour and comforting all at once. For families from the coastal South and Caribbean, this dish was not just food. It was a memory of sunlight, laughter, and work well done. It was a taste of mothers stirring pots over open fires, of children running barefoot through red dirt yards. Sorrel leaf stew reminded everyone that strength grew from soil and struggle, that flavor could come from the simplest gift of the land. When a spoon dipped into that steaming bowl, it carried the sound of old prayers and soft voices calling people to eat. In every swallow lived the rhythm of survival, steady and sure, like the ocean tides that shaped those who first made it. Mud pie was not the dessert people think of today, but a savory meal that brought warmth when meat was scarce. It began with mashed potatoes, thick and creamy from yesterday's supper, spread across the bottom of a pan. A layer of bread crusts came next, torn from loaves that had grown stiff with time. Then came a pour of rich brown gravy, made from drippings and flour, seeping into the bread and potatoes like rain into soil. When it baked, the top turned dark and glossy, the inside soft and heavy with flavor. It looked muddy, hence its name, but it tasted like comfort itself. Families made it on Sundays, when scraps were gathered and hope was baked back into the week. The smell filled the house and called everyone to the table. Children fought for the crispy corners while parents smiled in quiet relief. Mud pie carried pride in every bite, the kind of pride that came from making something out of almost nothing. It was a meal that felt like a miracle, served hot from the oven and eaten slow, one spoonful at a time, a reminder that even hard days could end sweetly. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Watermelon rind hash was a dish that proved nothing in a southern kitchen ever truly went to waste. After the sweet red fruit was eaten down to its pale skin, the green rinds were peeled, diced, and saved for the next meal. They were boiled until soft, then tossed into a skillet with onions, peppers, and a pinch of spice. What came out of that pan was golden and glistening, sweet with a hint of salt, smelling faintly of summer rain and backyard laughter. The rind soaked up flavor like memory itself, turning something forgotten into something worth savoring. Families served it with cornbread or rice, sometimes even cold the next morning with eggs. It filled bellies when money was short and reminded everyone that resourcefulness could taste as good as plenty. The sizzle in the skillet sounded like hope, sharp and quick. the sign that something good was about to happen. Watermelon rind hash was not just food, it was gratitude on a plate. Every bite told the story of people who refused to waste even the smallest blessing. It was sweet, it was humble, and it carried the quiet genius of survival, transforming scraps into a celebration that no one ever forgot. Hominy crackle porridge was the kind of breakfast that came from patience, not plenty. When there was no bacon, no biscuits, and not much else in the pantry, leftover hominy saved the day. It was stirred into a pot with water or milk, sweetened with molasses, and spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon if you had it. The sound of the spoon scraping against the pot made a rhythm that felt almost like music, slow and steady like morning itself. When the porridge bubbled, it released a scent both earthy and rich, a blend of smoke, sugar, and warmth. Children would sit waiting with chipped bowls in their hands, ready for the first ladle. It was thick and creamy, sometimes with a thin golden crust if it sat long enough. Hominy crackle porridge filled bellies and lifted moods, turning scraps into something special. It reminded families that sweetness did not depend on sugar alone, but on love and endurance. Every spoonful was a story of thrift and tenderness, made from what was left and shared without complaint. When the bowl was empty, people still felt full, not just from the food, but from the comfort it brought to a hard world made softer by care. Molasses coffee was not fancy, but it was strong enough to keep a person going through the longest of days. When coffee beans were scarce, and sugar even scarcer, someone clever discovered that a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into hot water or weak brew could make a drink both sweet and smoky. The result was thick and dark, with a bitterness that clung to the tongue and warmed the chest. It tasted like work and resilience, like fields at sunrise and factory bells ringing. Families drank it early and often, some adding milk if fortune allowed, others taking it plain with bread crusts for breakfast. It was a poor man's luxury, a small rebellion against hunger and fatigue. The smell alone was enough to wake the tired and remind them that strength could be stirred, not bought. Molasses coffee was courage in a cup, shared by hands cracked from labor and hearts that refused to quit. It carried the spirit of people who built their mornings out of willpower and steam, proving that dignity could live even in the thinnest brew. Soot biscuits were the kind of food you learned to trust when the fire was all you had. They were baked in soot-covered Dutch ovens, set right into the coals until the smell of toasted flour filled the air. The outsides came out black and charred, but inside they were soft, warm, and sweet from the faint taste of smoke. You brushed off the ash and split them open, steam rising like a small blessing. They were eaten with syrup, molasses, or even gravy if the morning allowed it. Families traveling, camping, or working the land knew this trick well. It was food that came straight from the earth and fire, raw and honest. Soot biscuits did not look like much, but they carried pride. They were proof that comfort could come from the simplest effort, that even ashes could feed the body and soothe the soul. The smell lingered on your hands and clothes, a reminder that good things sometimes came wrapped in smoke. Each bite tasted like work and gratitude, the flavor of survival baked in real flame. Turnip-top dumplings were humble food turned holy. You started with a pot of greens simmering low, their smoky scent winding through the house. Bits of flour dough were pinched and dropped into the bubbling pot, swelling as they cooked and soaking up every trace of pepper and salt. The broth grew thick and rich, tasting of the land and the love poured into it. People called it poor man's stew, but it filled the heart as much as the belly. Served, steaming in old bowls, it felt like warmth made visible. Children dipped crusts of bread into it while adults closed their eyes and savored the peace it brought. The dumplings were soft and chewy, little pockets of memory, flavored by patience and time. It was a meal for winter nights, for families gathered close, for prayers whispered over steam. Turnip-top dumplings carried a lesson that still matters. Food is never about wealth, but about care. In every spoonful was the proof that small things, done with love, could feed a world. Corn husk pudding was dessert for those who knew how to make the earth sweet. Fresh corn was grated by hand until the bowl filled with golden pulp, then mixed with butter, brown sugar, and milk. The batter was spooned into husks and tied with twine before being steamed until tender. When peeled open, the pudding glowed with a soft yellow shine, smelling of sugar and summer air. Its texture was smooth, its flavor deep and gentle. Families made it for celebrations or simply to remember happier days. It was the kind of sweetness that did not rush, a joy built slowly over a simmering pot. The husks were more than wrappers. They were vessels of gratitude, holding together flavor, memory, and time. Each bite tasted like sunshine, patience, and the steady hands that never stopped creating beauty from simplicity. Corn husk pudding was proof that sweetness does not need gold or cream, only the wisdom to cherish what you already have. It was the song of Southern kitchens, tender and enduring. Salt and sugar apples were a quick delight on long afternoons when the pantry was bare. A single apple could become a treat with just a pinch of salt and a sprinkle of sugar rubbed into its skin. The salt made the sweetness shine, the sugar made the tartness dance, and together they created a taste sharper than candy. Children learned this trick from mothers and grandmothers who refused to let poverty steal joy. It was a snack that cost nothing but offered everything: brightness, laughter, and something to hold on to. Workers carried salted apples to the fields, students packed them for lunch, and families ate them under porches as the day cooled. The juice ran down your fingers, sticky and satisfying, proof that small pleasures still existed even when times were hard. Salt and sugar apples were a symbol of gratitude, of finding sweetness in hardship. They taught a quiet lesson that flavor does not come from excess, but from attention. Every bite felt like hope, crisp, honest, and alive. Fried green tomato. Po' boys turned unripe tomatoes into a sandwich that tasted like pure coastal sunshine wrapped in crunchy cornmeal. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried until their edges crisped and their centers softened just enough to release a bright tang. Piled high on soft French bread with a smear of remoulade and a handful of shredded lettuce, they became a favorite along Gulf Coast streets where shrimp boats docked and music floated from open windows. Vendors often sold them at fish fries and fairs when seafood prices climbed too high, proving that a garden vegetable could carry the day as well as any oyster or crab. Families remembered the scent of hot oil and the pop of cornmeal batter while waiting in line for a sandwich that blended thrift and celebration. Today, fast food counters try to imitate the flavor, but they cannot capture the quiet magic of fresh garden tomatoes picked before ripening, fried in backyard kitchens, and shared among neighbors who knew the value of every bite. Blackberry molasses cobbler was a sticky, smoky dessert that belonged to cast-iron skillets and long summer nights. The berries were gathered wild from fence lines and hedges, their juice staining fingers and laughter alike. Mixed with thick, dark molasses and a handful of sugar, they turned into a bubbling, fragrant filling. The crust was poured over top, sometimes biscuit dough, sometimes batter, and baked until the edges burned just enough to taste like smoke. It was messy and imperfect, but that was part of its beauty. The syrup thickened into a glossy black glaze that clung to every bite, sweet with a whisper of bitterness. People spooned it hot into bowls, sometimes with milk or cream, but it never needed help. Blackberry molasses cobbler tasted like work and reward, like something earned under the sun. It was the dessert that reminded families that sweetness could survive the hardest days, that joy could bubble up even from thorns. Mustard greens with cornbread was a savory pairing that many families leaned on as a breakfast, though it was eaten at other times of day too. Mustard greens, boiled until tender, were seasoned with bits of pork fat or salt for flavor. Eaten alongside hot cornbread, the meal balanced vitamins with starch, offering both nutrition and energy. It was cheap, filling, and deeply tied to tradition. For children, the bitterness of the greens was often softened by crumbling cornbread into the Potlikker broth, making it more palatable. Adults valued it as a sustaining meal that honored resourcefulness and cultural heritage. Mustard greens with cornbread symbolized strength and survival, representing the kind of food that nourished more than just hunger. It was humble, but it carried families through mornings when resources were thin, but resolve was strong. This dish was one of the quiet backbones of community kitchens, a reflection of endurance and resilience during times of hardship. Old-fashioned tea cakes tasted like quiet afternoons and childhood visits to Grandma's house, their soft sugar cookie texture carrying a gentle vanilla fragrance. Butter, sugar, and fresh eggs were beaten together until light, then mixed with flour and a hint of nutmeg to create a dough that chilled before baking. Rolled and cut into simple rounds, the cakes puffed slightly as they baked, filling the kitchen with a sweet, buttery aroma. Neither overly sweet nor bland, they struck a perfect balance that invited dunking in tea or milk. Families treasured these cookies for their simplicity and the way they invited conversation, often baking them in large batches to share with neighbors. In the 1970s, tea cakes were a quiet staple of African American hospitality, a link to centuries of tradition. Each soft bite carried the comfort of home and the memory of loving hands, reminding everyone that sometimes the most unassuming desserts are the ones that linger longest in the heart. Okra fritters, also known as okra cakes, offered crisp, golden edges and a tender interior that celebrated the summer garden. Fresh okra pods were chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, onions, and a dash of pepper, then spooned into hot oil until each patty puffed and browned. Sold at fish fries, church picnics, and traveling fairs, these fritters were easy to eat by hand and full of flavor that tied African heritage to southern soil. The okra gave a subtle sweetness and a soft binding that kept the patties moist while the cornmeal crust provided satisfying crunch. Children waited impatiently beside bubbling skillets, hoping for the first fritter to cool enough to taste. Vendors wrapped them in newspaper cones so families could stroll through evening air scented with music and spice. Modern snack foods have replaced these handcrafted treats, but those who remember the sound of oil popping and the taste of garden-fresh okra know the fritters carried more than flavor. They held the joy of gathering and the pride of turning humble crops into a festival of taste. Collard green and onion hash gave leafy greens a starring role, turning a traditional dinner side into a savory breakfast companion. Fresh collard greens were sliced thin and quickly sautéed with sweet onions, a little garlic, and a splash of vegetable broth until tender yet vibrant. The result was a smoky, nutrient-rich hash that paired beautifully with eggs, grits, or cornbread. Some families added diced potatoes for extra heartiness, while others seasoned with a pinch of red pepper flakes to wake up the taste buds. This dish reflected a deep appreciation for garden vegetables and the ingenuity of African American cooks who brought dinner flavors to the morning table. Collard green and onion hash provided iron, vitamins, and a satisfying warmth that lasted through long days. Its quick preparation and bold taste made it a weekday favorite, while its connection to Southern tradition made it feel timeless, proving that breakfast could be as wholesome and flavorful as any evening meal. Hominy pancakes were another clever way families stretched resources into filling meals. Hominy, boiled corn kernels treated with lye, was folded into simple flour batter and fried on a hot griddle until crisp on the edges. The result was a pancake that was hearty, chewy, and rich in flavor. Families leaned on this dish because hominy was inexpensive, filling, and often available in bulk. These pancakes were served plain or topped with syrup, molasses, or even just butter when sugar was scarce. Children enjoyed the slightly nutty texture, while adults appreciated that it carried them through long hours of work. Hominy pancakes were tied to heritage too, with roots reaching back to Native American food traditions that influenced Southern cooking. They were a reminder of resilience and cultural continuity, showing how simple staples could be reinvented to meet new needs. Hominy pancakes filled stomachs, but they also filled mornings with the comfort of tradition and the creativity of making do. Charred sweet potato peel tea was the drink of those who refused to give up warmth even when comfort seemed gone. When sugar was low and coffee was nothing but memory, families gathered the peels of sweet potatoes, rinsed them, and laid them across open flames until the edges blackened and curled. The smell was deep and smoky, the scent of fire and sweetness twined together. Once roasted, the peels were steeped in boiling water, turning the liquid a soft amber brown with a flavor that felt older than the land itself. Some people added honey or molasses for richness, others drank it plain, savoring the faint caramel taste that soothed the heart. It was a quiet ritual, often shared at the end of long days, when words were few but peace was needed. The steam rose like a prayer, the kind that carried both sorrow and gratitude. Charred sweet potato peel tea was not about luxury or comfort. It was about memory, care, and the belief that warmth could always be found again. It was love brewed slowly, proof that even ashes could hold sweetness. Pickled watermelon rind was a dish born out of a waste-not spirit. When families ate fresh watermelon, they saved the rinds, slicing off the tough green skin and brining the white flesh in vinegar, sugar, and spices. The result was a tangy, sweet pickle that could be eaten alongside meats, beans, or cornbread. In hard times, nothing edible was thrown away, and this recipe proved that even scraps could become something delicious. Pickled rind added brightness to plates that were otherwise heavy with starch and salt, lifting meals and making them feel more balanced. Children loved the odd flavor, and adults appreciated that it stretched food supplies further. Pickled watermelon rind became common in many Southern households, passed down as a recipe of ingenuity. It turned what was once destined for the trash into something cherished, embodying the creativity of Black families making do with what they had. Sheep sorrel soup brought a welcome spark of bright flavor after months of heavy grains and salted meat scraps. This common wild plant, with its arrow-shaped leaves and natural lemony tang, grew freely in meadows and along woodland edges. Enslaved gatherers picked the young leaves early in spring, rinsed them well, and simmered them with water and a handful of onions or garlic if available. The result was a light, refreshing broth rich in vitamin C and a gentle tartness that awakened tired palates. African culinary traditions often prized sour greens, and this soup reflected that taste while also serving an important nutritional role in preventing scurvy. After emancipation, sheep sorrel remained a favorite wild green in many rural communities, used in teas and simple soups that celebrated the arrival of warmer weather. Today, foragers still seek it for its tangy bite and health benefits. Sheep sorrel soup stands as a quiet example of how careful observation of the land turned common weeds into an enduring part of Southern culinary heritage. Skillet. Fried catfish with cornmeal crust was the pride of riverbank communities and churchyard gatherings. Fishermen returned at dawn with fresh-caught catfish while cooks prepared heavy iron skillets filled with hot lard or peanut oil. Fillets were dredged in seasoned cornmeal until every piece was coated in a golden layer ready for the crackling pan. The sizzle of fish hitting the oil was music to children waiting for the first crisp bite. Friday fish fries became weekly celebrations where neighbors brought sides of slaw and hush puppies, and stories flowed as freely as sweet tea. The flavor of smoky river water lingered in each flaky bite, reminding everyone of the connection between food and place. Modern diners may order catfish in restaurants, but the ritual of catching, cleaning, and frying by the water's edge has faded, leaving only memories of warm evenings when the entire town smelled of cornmeal and spice and laughter carried across the banks. Giblet gravy over rice was one of those dinners that showed how nothing went to waste in the kitchen. Chicken was expensive, but the innards, the gizzard, liver, and heart were cheap or sometimes even given away by butchers. My grandmother chopped them small, simmered them in broth, and thickened the pot into a rich gravy that smelled like Sunday supper. Poured over rice, it became hearty enough to stretch across the whole family. The rice soaked up the flavor, turning a small handful of giblets into a meal that fed 6 mouths without complaint. Some children turned up their noses at first, but hunger taught quick appreciation, and the taste of the gravy was strong, savory, and full of life. She said, "Giblet gravy was proof that dignity came not from the cut of meat, but from the hands that prepared it." In the 1960s, this dish carried people through lean nights, filling bowls with warmth when little else could be afforded. Giblet gravy over rice was frugality turned into something satisfying. Boiled peanuts may sound like a simple snack, but they carried deep meaning during times when money was short. Fresh green peanuts were harvested from fields and boiled slowly in salted water until soft, turning them into something filling and protein-rich. They were sold by street vendors, shared at church gatherings, and eaten hot from pots on family stoves. The salty, earthy flavor made them addictive, and because peanuts were relatively inexpensive, they became a food that was both affordable and sustaining. For many Black families, boiled peanuts represented community and togetherness as much as they did thrift. They were eaten by hand, cracked open while people talked, sang, or worked, making them a food tied closely to everyday life. In hard times, they were cheap enough to feel like a small luxury, a treat that was still practical. Boiled peanuts became more than food. They were a shared memory, passed down across generations. Persimmon seed coffee emerged when imported beans were rare or too costly for enslaved communities. Wild persimmons dropped their fruit in autumn, and the hard seeds inside were washed, dried, and roasted until dark and fragrant. Ground and steeped in hot water, they produced a warm, nutty beverage with no caffeine but plenty of comfort on cold mornings. This practice carried forward after the Civil War, especially during wartime shortages when coffee imports faltered again. Families across the South roasted persimmon seeds alongside chicory or other local substitutes, proving the durability of this inventive method. The gentle flavor and toasty aroma made it a beloved alternative long after necessity faded. Today, a few heritage festivals still brew persimmon seed coffee to honor the ingenuity of those who first discovered its rich taste. The drink reminds us that creativity in the face of scarcity can yield traditions that outlast the circumstances that gave birth to them, turning survival into a legacy of flavor and resilience. Chitlins Holiday Feast once marked winter celebrations with an aroma as unforgettable as the labor required to prepare it. Hog intestines were cleaned thoroughly, then simmered for hours with onions, vinegar, and spices until tender. The dish demanded patience and community, often bringing families together for a full day of washing and cooking. Served with hot sauce and cornbread, chitlins carried the history of using every part of the animal, a practice born of necessity during slavery and carried forward as a mark of resilience. Despite the strong scent that filled kitchens and neighborhoods, the feast represented abundance and pride, especially during Christmas and New Year gatherings. Elders spoke of the old days while younger generations learned the careful methods required to make the dish safe and flavorful. In many places, health concerns and changing tastes have pushed chitlins aside, but the tradition still holds a powerful place in memory as a symbol of perseverance and celebration. Pork crackling cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, small crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklins carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. Sweet potato biscuits with honey were a beloved comfort food that turned humble ingredients into something special. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in the South, cheap to grow, and full of natural sweetness. By mashing them into biscuit dough, families created soft, tender breads that did not require as much flour or fat. Fresh biscuits out of the oven were topped with a drizzle of local honey if it was available, making them feel indulgent despite their simplicity. These biscuits were often served for breakfast, but they could also accompany stews or fried fish. They filled stomachs and brought warmth to the table, offering both nutrition and comfort. Sweet potatoes symbolized resilience, and honey added a touch of hope in difficult times. Together, they created a dish that carried meaning well beyond its taste. Sweet potato biscuits with honey reflected the heart of soul food, making something beautiful and memorable from ingredients that were always within reach. Roasted gourd seeds turned the remnants of pumpkins and native gourds into a vital source of fat and minerals. After the flesh was cooked for soups or pies, seeds were washed, lightly salted, and spread near the hearth to dry before roasting. This simple preparation produced a crunchy, nutrient-rich snack that stored well through the winter and could be ground into meal or used to thicken stews. Similar seed roasting traditions existed across West Africa, where pumpkin and melon seeds were prized for both flavor and nutrition, and those techniques crossed the Atlantic with enslaved people. Over time, roasted pumpkin seeds became a familiar autumn treat in American households, sold at fairs and enjoyed during harvest celebrations. The practice illustrates how African culinary memory merged with indigenous crops, creating a food that moved from necessity to seasonal pleasure. Roasted gourd seeds continue to appear in modern kitchens and farmers markets, carrying with them the history of careful saving and the resourceful spirit that turned every part of the plant into nourishment. Wild muscadine grape jam brought the late summer woods to the breakfast table in a deep purple shine. Children and parents walked along fence lines and wooded edges with baskets in hand, searching for the thick-skinned grapes that thrived in southern heat. Once gathered, the fruit was boiled gently until the skins burst and the pulp softened, filling kitchens with a fragrance that hinted at honey and earth. The juice was strained and mixed with sugar, then cooked again until it thickened into a jam rich enough to spread over biscuits or stir into morning porridge. Families prized each jar, knowing that muscadines grew wild and free, needing only careful hands and patience to become something sweet. In some towns, church groups organized picking days, turning the harvest into a social event where songs and laughter echoed through the vines. Today, supermarket grapes have replaced the wild hunt, and store-bought jams lack the musky depth of fruit ripened under southern sun. But memories of purple-stained fingers still linger in many hearts. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs was another way families stretched cheap vegetables into full meals. Turnips were easy to grow and often given away, their strong flavor softened by boiling them until tender. My grandmother ladled the hot turnips into bowls and topped them with crumbled cornbread, the bread soaking up the broth until it became hearty enough for supper. It was plain food, yes, but it kept stomachs full on nights when meat was scarce. The bitterness of the turnips mellowed with time and seasoning, and the cornbread gave every bite body and comfort. Children might have grumbled, but they ate their fill because there was no room for waste. In the 1960s, this dish was common across kitchens that relied on ingenuity to make ends meet. It was a simple combination, yet it carried dignity because it represented survival. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs may not have been fancy, but it held families together through lean times. Fried corn pone was a dish that required almost nothing but cornmeal, water, and lard, yet it managed to fill stomachs during times of want. It was denser than cornbread and more rustic, formed into small patties and fried in cast-iron skillets until golden. Families leaned on it for breakfast, lunch, or supper because it was inexpensive, used ingredients they almost always had, and could be made quickly. Corn was abundant across the South, and every pantry had a sack of cornmeal that could be stretched into meals again and again. Eating fried corn pone often meant there was no wheat bread to be had, but no one went hungry. It was eaten with beans, dipped in potlikker, or just on its own with a smear of molasses or syrup if available. Fried corn pone reflected the determination to create something warm and satisfying even when the cupboards were close to bare. Elderflower cordial brought delicate sweetness and subtle healing to kitchens that often lacked sugar and fruit. When elder shrubs burst into fragrant clusters in early summer, gatherers clipped the blossoms and steeped them in water with a touch of honey or sorghum to create a lightly floral syrup. This cordial could be sipped as a soothing drink, stirred into simple desserts, or used as a gentle remedy for coughs and fevers. The method reflected old-world European customs while blending with African-American herbal practice, showing how cultures met in the shared search for flavor and wellness. Long after emancipation, elderflower cordial remained a quiet luxury in rural households, prized for its refreshing taste during hot southern days. Today, it reappears in cocktails and artisanal sodas, but its roots lie in careful foraging and centuries of folk medicine. Elderflower cordial proves that even in times of want, people found ways to capture the fleeting perfume of summer and preserve it for moments of calm and celebration. If one of these lost soul foods brought back a memory, drop it in the comments and subscribe so the taste of history keeps cooking.